There is a bean sitting in a seed catalog right now that beats ground beef on protein, grows on a windowsill, and takes about 5 minutes a day to tend. Not 5 hours, 5 minutes. And if you ask 100 people walking down the street to name it, maybe one of them can. That's not an accident. That's not bad luck. Somewhere between a Sri Lankan kitchen garden and your local grocery store, this plant got quietly filed away. And I'm going to walk you through exactly how that happened, plant by plant, decade by decade, until you understand the whole pattern. Stick around to the end because I'm going to give you the exact plant, the exact seed source, and the exact 5-minute routine to get it growing on your own sill, starting tonight. Let's start with the number, because the number is what should stop you cold. Mature seeds from this plant run close to 30 grams of protein per 100 grams dry weight. Lean ground beef, cooked, lands somewhere in the low 20s. Seed for seed, this plant is out-proteining a cow, and it does it while fixing nitrogen into your soil for free and handing you 4 separate harvests off the exact same vine. Before I tell you what it's called, I want you to drop something in the comments for me. Tell me the last time you actually grew your own food from a saved seed, not a store-bought seedling, an actual seed you kept from last year's harvest. I want to see how many of you still have that habit alive, because it matters for what I'm about to tell you. The plant is called the winged bean. Botanically, it's Sophocarpus tetragonalobus, but nobody in the villages where it's been grown for centuries calls it that. They just call it food. The pods are 4-sided and crunchy, closer to a snow pea than a green bean, and they're eaten raw, straight off the vine, by kids who don't know they're supposed to be excited about vegetables. The leaves cook down exactly like spinach and carry a genuinely staggering amount of vitamin A, in some varieties well over 10,000 international units per 100 grams. The flowers go into salads, and if you let the vine run a full season in a deep enough container, there's a starchy tuber underground that outperforms a potato on protein and has a texture somewhere between a water chestnut and a baked sweet potato. One plant, one seed, 4 separate crops off the same vine, spread across the entire growing season. There's actually a 5th layer to this that most people miss entirely, and it's worth pausing on before we go further. In parts of East Africa and Southeast Asia, bean plants in general, not just the winged bean, are treated as genuine 2-stage crops. The tender leaf tips get harvested every few days, almost like you'd cut fresh basil, weeks before the pods ever set. Those young leaves cook down like spinach, carry real iron and protein of their own, and in the case of the winged bean specifically, deliver vitamin A levels high enough to function as a daily multivitamin on their own. You can be eating fresh greens off that vine for a solid month before a single pod even forms. Western commercial bean breeding, running roughly from the 1930s forward, selected almost entirely for pod yield and dropped leaf quality off the list of traits that mattered, simply because nobody was buying bean leaves at a Western grocery store. If a variety can't be sold as a leaf crop, nobody bothers breeding it to taste good as one, and an entire dimension of a single plant's usefulness quietly disappears from the conversation in about 1 generation. Tell me in the comments if you've ever eaten bean leaves or pea shoots, and if so, how you prepared them. I'm genuinely curious how many people already know this trick versus how many are hearing about it for the first time right now. So here's the question worth sitting with. If a single plant can genuinely do all of that, why has almost nobody in North America ever heard its name? The honest answer isn't a conspiracy in the cartoonish sense. It's simpler and, frankly, more believable than that. It's a story about where research money goes and what happens to a crop when nobody can turn it into a shelf-stable, brandable commodity. Back in the 1960s and into the early 1970s, a wave of international agricultural funding known as the Green Revolution poured enormous sums into a small handful of staple crops, primarily wheat, rice, and maize. Those crops got the funding because they could be standardized, shipped, stored, and traded as global commodities. The winged bean, by contrast, is the opposite of a commodity crop. It's savable, it's regionally adapted, it thrives best on a small scale, in a home garden or a smallholder plot, and it doesn't lend itself to giant monoculture fields the way corn does. A crop that thrives at kitchen garden scale doesn't attract the kind of institutional research money that a crop destined for a global grain market does. So while wheat and rice research exploded, Winged bean research got what agricultural researchers politely call a rounding error. Tell me in the comments, have you ever heard of the winged bean before this video? Be honest. I want to see the number, because I have a feeling it's going to be a lot smaller than you'd expect for a plant this useful. Fast forward to 2020, and a peer-reviewed agricultural science journal published a full-length review of the winged bean's nutritional and agricultural potential. The paper used the word underutilized more than a dozen times throughout, which is the polite academic way of saying the market simply never made room for it. The researchers weren't discovering anything new. They were documenting something that smallholder farmers across South and Southeast Asia had known and practiced for generations. An agronomist visiting a rural garden in the 1970s could watch a single family feed themselves off one vine 4 different ways, using seed they'd saved from the year before. That knowledge never disappeared, it just never made it onto a Western grocery shelf because there was no processing step, no branding opportunity, no 30% margin sitting inside a bag of raw seed. And that pattern, once you notice it, keeps repeating across an entire category of foods that used to be common kitchen staples and have quietly slid out of the American diet. Take sprouted legumes as a whole. A wide-mouthed jar, a square of cheesecloth, a rubber band, and a handful of mung beans soaked overnight is a genuinely ancient piece of kitchen technology. Rinse twice a day. Prop the jar at an angle so it drains, and within 3 to 5 days, you have a jar full of crisp, protein-dense sprouts that cost you pennies. That exact method fed households for generations before commercial food ever entered the picture. Then, in the mid-1990s, a run of foodborne illness outbreaks tied to commercially grown sprouts, produced in large-scale sanitation conditions that had nothing to do with a clean jar on a home kitchen shelf, triggered a wave of federal food safety advisories. The advisories were aimed at industrial-scale sprout production, but the message that reached most people was simply sprouts are risky. Full stop. A home method that had worked safely for centuries got lumped in with a completely different industrial-scale problem, and an entire generation quietly stopped keeping a sprouting jar on the counter. Comment below if your grandparents kept a jar like that going. I want to hear what they sprouted, because I guarantee the answers are going to be more interesting than mine. Or take the classic pairing of legumes and grains in the same bowl, something nutrition science calls a complementary protein. Dry lentils run around 24 grams of protein per 100 grams. Pair them with a grain like wheat or rice, and together they supply a full amino acid profile that neither one delivers completely on its own. That combination fed entire civilizations for thousands of years, from ancient river valley communities straight through to your own great-grandmother's kitchen. Nutrition textbooks still teach the amino acid science behind why the pairing works. What quietly dropped out of the picture was the everyday habit of actually eating that way, because somewhere along the line, a much more heavily marketed alternative showed up on the shelf next to it. Plant-based meat substitutes built on isolated pea or soy protein now routinely sell for 5 to 8 times the price per pound of the raw legumes they're extracted from, and the manufacturing margin on that processing step is where the real money sits. Nobody makes that kind of margin selling you a $2 bag of dried lentils. If you've made the switch back to cooking with whole legumes instead of buying the processed substitutes, tell me about it in the comments. I want to know what convinced you, because that's exactly the kind of small habit shift this whole video is about. Now here's where the pattern gets even more literal, because it isn't just about which foods get marketed and which don't. It's about who gets to legally keep growing them at all. For most of American agricultural history, seed saving was simply how farming worked. You grew a crop, you dried and stored a portion of the seed, and you replanted it the following season at essentially zero cost beyond your own labor. That changed with the rise of hybrid and later patented seed varieties starting in the early 20th century. Hybrid seed genuinely does outperform open-pollinated seed in yield during its first generation, but seed saved from a hybrid crop and replanted the following year produces wildly inconsistent results, which quietly forces farmers back to the seed company every single spring. By the final decades of the 20th century, seed patents had extended well beyond field corn into garden vegetables, and agricultural companies pursued legal action against farmers who saved and replanted patented seed. Home gardeners largely followed the same trend, and a habit that once cost a farm family nothing became, for many people, an annual purchase instead. That's exactly why organizations like seed-saving cooperatives and community seed exchanges have grown in popularity over the past few decades, precisely as a counterweight to that shift. A jar of seed you saved yourself still cost nothing to replant. That fact never changed. What changed was how many people remembered it was even an option. Drop a comment if you've ever saved seed from your own garden to replant the next year. And if you haven't, tell me what's stopping you, because I promise it's a lot simpler than most people assume. The same story shows up again in synthetic fertilizer. Legumes, including the winged bean, fix atmospheric nitrogen into the soil through bacteria living in nodules on their roots, meaning a legume crop actually leaves the soil richer than it found it, ready for whatever you plant there next. In the early 20th century, the invention of an industrial process for synthesizing ammonia fertilizer from atmospheric nitrogen made a bag of synthetic fertilizer cheaper and more convenient than a traditional crop rotation built around legumes. That industrial fertilizer approach genuinely simplified large-scale farming, but it also came with a recurring annual cost that a legume rotation doesn't carry, and it gradually eroded the very soil microbial life that made the older rotation method self-sustaining in the first place. Grow a legume, follow it with something else that benefits from that fixed nitrogen, and repeat. And you're running the same system your great-grandparents ran for free. So let's bring this back around to the plant we started with, because every single thread in this video points straight back to it. A single winged bean vine, grown in a deep planter on a sunny south-facing windowsill, will give you tender young leaves within a matter of weeks, crisp, edible pods not long after that, mature, high-protein seed by the end of the season, and if the container is deep enough, a starchy tuber underground, on top of all of it. The whole operation costs a few dollars in seed, takes roughly 5 minutes a day of actual hands-on care, rinsing, watering, checking the vine, and produces more usable protein per square foot than almost anything else you could put in that same container. And because it's a legume, it improves whatever soil it's growing in for the next thing you plant there. None of that is speculation. It's documented in peer-reviewed agricultural literature, and it's been lived experience for smallholder families across South and Southeast Asia for longer than any of us have been alive. The plant was never hidden, it just never had a marketing budget, and a food without a marketing budget has a way of quietly disappearing from a culture's collective memory within a generation or two, whether or not it ever stopped being useful. Before you go, I need you to do 3 things in the comments, because this next part is genuinely going to shape what I make next. First, tell me if you're going to try growing one of these, the winged bean, a jar of sprouted mung beans, or even just a simple lentil and rice bowl this week, and which one you're picking. Second, tell me what your own family used to grow or save that quietly disappeared somewhere along the way. I want to hear the specifics, the variety names if you remember them. And third, if there's a specific old kitchen garden staple you want me to trace the full story on next, name it below, because the comments on this channel are genuinely where the next video idea comes from. Here's the practical version. No fluff. Order a small packet of winged bean seed online this week. It typically runs around $4 for a full packet. Get a deep container, at least 12 inches, since it needs room for that tuber if you want the full 4-harvest experience. Set it on your sunniest windowsill and give it a stake or a trellis to climb, because it's a vigorous vine. Water it, check it, and in a matter of weeks, you'll be snapping off your first pods. Save a portion of that seed at the end of the season, store it dry in a labeled jar, and you'll never need to buy that packet again. 1 plant, 4 harvests, 5 minutes a day, and a piece of knowledge that was never actually lost, just waiting for somebody to hand it back to you. Let me know down below what you're planting first, and I'll see you in the next one.